Hello, fellow podcast enthusiasts.
My name is Rachel.
And I'm Neil, and together we are a husband and wife duo and the hosts of Mad or Bad, a true crime podcast.
Mad or Bad is a true crime podcast with a psychological twist, which takes a look at true crime cases from the UK and around the world. We cover murders, serial killers, disappearances, abuse scandals, and much more.
We have a special interest in murders local to where we live in England. However, we also love covering other lesser known cases from around the world. We also love discussing psychological phenomena and how it relates to true crime.
So join us every Monday for a new true crime story where we discuss crime, murder, psychology, and much more.
Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
You're listening to the True Crime Witch podcast, the podcast that takes you into everything murderous, mysterious, and downright macabre. I'm your host Emma, and you're listening to episode 25, The Doll Maker of Russia. I have just one shout out this week for Eileen from the Crime Lapse True Crime podcast, who gave me a 5-star review and a rating on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much. If you'd also like a shout out, all you gotta do is just leave us a 5-star review, rating, and I will read you out in the next episode. If you'd like to support this one-on-one podcast, you can head over to my Patreon at www.patreon.com/truecrimewitchpodcast. You'll get early access to episodes, exclusive content, and you'll be able to help me keep the podcast running, and I can't thank you enough. You can find the podcast on Twitter just by searching at True Crime Witch, Instagram at True Crime Witch Podcast. I have a Facebook page and a Facebook group, so if you just search the True Crime Witch Podcast, I shall appear. Warning, the True Crime Witch Podcast covers topics such as rape, murder, crimes against children, and other sensitive topics. This podcast won't be for everyone, and your discretion is advised. This is episode 25, The Doll Maker of Russia. On January 24th, 2011, 2 suicide bombers detonated homemade improvised bombs in the arrival baggage areas of the Domodedovo airport in Moscow, Russia. The homemade bombs were packed tight with shrapnel and other pieces of material to cause maximum damage and exploded with the force of 5 kilos of TNT. The bombs were detonated at 4:32 Moscow time, and within minutes the devastation was clear to see. After the smoke had settled and the panic had subsided, 37 innocent people lost their lives in the bombings. Another 173 people were injured in the ensuing chaos, changing the landscape of the airport forever. 20-year-old Magom Yelolev from the North Caucasus claimed responsibility and claimed the attack was on behalf of the Islamist extremist group Caucasus Emirate. They aimed to injure and kill any foreign citizens making their way back into Russia. The geopolitical relationships between Russia, the Caucasus, and the Muslims federations that are within that are extremely complicated you could say, and they're something that I would probably have to explore in another episode. Following the terrorist attack, tensions were running high within Russia. Islamophobia ran rampant, hate seemed to spew out of every crack of society. People were scared, they were angry. So when Muslim graves in the city of Nizhny Novgorod were being desecrated, local police believed that this was a retaliation for the terrorist attack. What the police would uncover would be darker than the residents of Nizhny Novgorod could have ever imagined. This is episode 25 of the True Crime Witch podcast. Anatoly Moskvin, the doll maker of Russia, if you hadn't already guessed what this week's episode was going to be about. Anatoly Moskvin was born as Anatoly Yurovich Moskvin on September 1st, 1966 in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia, to parents Elvira and Yuri Moskvin. By all accounts, Anatoly was a quiet child who stayed out of trouble. He was seen by other children as sort of strange, but quiet nonetheless. In an interview that he gave to a newspaper in 2007, Moskvin described how he would often wander through graveyards and cemeteries from a very early age. He claimed that between 2005 and 2007 alone, he had visited 752 cemeteries in just the area of Nizhny Novgorod, covering at least 20 miles on foot per day. During his 2-year trek, he claimed to have only drunk from puddles and slept wherever he could, even sometimes in coffins that were being prepared for burial. Fucking weird. In March 1979, something happened to Anatoly that would forever change his interests in funerals and dying. It wasn't something that put him off, like it would most people. This event triggered the spiral of insanity that Anatoly would find himself in way into his adulthood. 11-year-old Natasha Petrova was taking a bath in her standard Soviet bloc apartment. Her father had died some years earlier, which left only Natasha and her mother in the apartment. Because her father had passed away, the apartment had fallen into disrepair and required some serious TLC. Not only just to make it, look like a nice place to live, but to actually make it safe. Natasha reached for the light switch to the bathroom, and in doing so, her wet towel touched the end of an exposed wire. Electricity coursed through her body, and sadly, Natasha died almost instantly from the exposure to electricity. Even though the pair hadn't gone to the same school, Anatoly knew of Natasha and had heard that she had died in a tragic accident at her apartment. He and a few school friends were snooping around different apartments, seeing if they could gather up any waste paper for a project that they were taking part in at school, and he attended School 184. Upon walking to the apartment building of Natasha Petrova, they were confronted by her coffin outside, ready for her funeral and burial. Disturbed at what they'd seen, the boys tried to run away and leave the funeral to carry on in peace. That's when men and women wearing all black grabbed Anatoly and took him into Natasha's apartment. Anatoly describes all of the men and women were wearing all black, burning candles, and singing what he described only as an old folk song. Natasha's mother appeared from the apartment, crying and wailing in grief of her 11-year-old daughter. She gave Anatoly a large apple and further promised him sweets, oranges, and money. That was when she forced Anatoly to kiss the waxy forehead of the deceased 11-year-old Natasha. Anatoly didn't have a choice as he was surrounded by people and was being pushed from the back of his head. Anatoly was forced to kiss Natasha 3 times and recite a spell in an old Russian folk language. Anatoly only being 13, he was very confused by what was happening. In his eyes, adults were supposed to be the ones that he trusted, not the ones that he feared. After he finished the spell, Anatoly was forced to drip red candle wax on Natasha's dress. To finally complete the bizarre ritual, Anatoly was given 2 wedding bands. One for him, and one for 11-year-old Natasha. With both wedding bands placed on their hands, the group announced that the couple were now married. Of course, Anatoly was very confused and disturbed by what had happened to him that day. He had never seen a corpse made into a doll-like form before, and he was even more disturbed that he was 13 and now apparently married. Natasha's family performed this ritual as she was too young to have been married in life, and they didn't want her to be alone in the afterlife. This pivotal event changed the course of Anatoly's life forever. What could have been an innocent enough interest in funeral traditions and the occult was moulded into something very dangerous. Anatoly carried on his teenage years with his interests in the occult and death only growing deeper and deeper. He even gained a degree in philology from the Moscow State University, choosing to specialise in Celtic history, folklore, death traditions, and rituals. One thing was apparent during Anatoly's teenage years. He was haunted by visions of his corpse bride, Natasha. She begged him to spend time with her and pay attention to her. The visions became so bad that they actually began to affect Anatoly's schooling. Anatoly had had enough of the haunting visions and performed a magic ceremony to transfer Natasha to a fellow school friend of his, allowing his life to return to normal. Anatoly reflected later on, "My strange marriage with Natasha Petrova was useful because it helped me develop an interest in serious magic ceremonies." Following his graduation from the philological facility at Moscow State University, Anatoly worked at the Nizhny Novgorod University as a lecturer in Celtic studies and impressively spoke 13 different languages. He was extremely well established within his academic circle. He was a bit odd, but people respected the seriousness and scope of his research. Within the academic landscape of Russia, Anatoly was known to be the expert on cemeteries, and especially those in the Nizhny Novgorod area. Needed to know something about burial rituals, headstones, or anything about death in general? Anatoly was your man. His main areas of study were, of course, cemeteries, but he also had special interest in burial rituals, death, Celtic history and folklore, and the occult. With a library that contained over 60,000 books, Anatoly was a very well-read man, and put a lot of time and effort into his research. Due to his immense wealth of knowledge, a colleague of Anatoly's, Oleg Ryabov, commissioned him to create a full list of every person buried in the 700 cemeteries scattered across Nizhny Novgorod. To any other person, the thought of trudging through graveyards and recording every detail seems like their worst nightmare. But then again, not everyone shares a morbid fascination with death like Anatoly and us guys do, so I guess this wouldn't be the worst job in the world for, people like us, but maybe for normal people it would be horrible. Anatoly took this job in his stride and claimed to have walked 18.6 miles a day inspecting the various cemeteries as he was tasked. According to him, he drank from puddles, slept wherever he could, such as haystacks, abandoned farms, or even in the cemetery itself. A bizarre claim from Anatoly goes that he spent a night's rest in a coffin that was being prepared for the next day. For over 2 years, Anatoly continued in this fashion, inspecting cemeteries, documenting them, and then moving along like a nomad. He refused to use public transport, and this seemed to fit in quite well with his secluded life. He didn't have a wife or any children waiting for him at home. Instead, he lived with his parents, who were quite supportive of his research. Unlike many young Russian men, Anatoly didn't drink, he didn't smoke, and he claimed to be, quote, pure in the fact that he was a virgin and he had no interest in divulging in such activities. To him, sex was pretty repulsive. His research gave him great access to cemeteries across the Nizhny Novgorod area, but Anatoly wasn't just conducting research as commissioned by the university. He was using this time for his own nefarious deeds. Warning, this is where it gets graphic, and it does contain information about children. You have been warned. Anatoly Moskvin was, first and foremost, a grave robber. But he didn't just take clothes, jewelries, or other valuables. He took corpses too. Moskvin said that he felt sorry for the dead children and that they were calling out to him to be resurrected. He thought he could bring them back to life using black magic, or a ceremony like one that he had been forced to partake in as a teenager. He would scour local newspapers looking for obituaries that spoke out to him, and would sleep on the grave to see if their spirit, so the girl's spirit, like Natasha's, came to him and spoke to him. Now, usually he said that they would beg to be set free. In his own words, he never dug up a child's grave without their express permission, and used his research commissioned by the university as a perfect guise for this. Because, of course, we all know that dead children can give permission for their graves to be exhumed. Totally makes sense, Anatoly. Anatoly himself said that he would lay on the girl's grave and talk to her. Get in touch with her. He would listen very carefully to what she said. He claims they often asked him to take them on a walk. He said himself that he was waiting for science to find ways for these girls to live again. 'Cause he's a Once he gained permission, Anatoly would exhume the child's body and dry them out using salt and baking soda, which also helped the smell. Obviously, the bodies were decaying, and Anatoly's attempt at black magic did little to slow this process down. So, he would wrap cloth around the girls in place of where their skin had once been, and stuff their bodies with bits of spare clothes or rags. Once the bodies had fully dried out, he would transport them to his apartment that he shared with his parents. Now, his parents were actually away most of the time. I believe they had like his summer house. They were retired, so they'd go off for half the year and do whatever retired people do. So he had his apartment all to himself, and this is why he was able to amass a collection of dolls over a 10-year period. Even when his parents were home, his elderly mother, Elvira, said, quote, "We saw these dolls, but we did not suspect there were dead bodies inside. We thought it was his hobby to make such big dolls and did not see anything wrong with it." End quote. Now that's some real cognitive dissonance shit, because to have 26 large dolls, it's a bit weird, not gonna lie, but whatever. So once the dolls were back in the apartment, he would restuff their bodies, making sure to correct the withering and shrinking from the drying process. The most bizarre part of his ritual was that he would create wax masks for the girls and place them over their faces to hide the decomposition. Anatoly would use nail polish and makeup for the masks, and dress the girls in bright clothes, wigs, and even put music boxes in their rib cages. To make the whole thing a little less fucking morbid. Anatoly would place the dolls around his apartment and treat them like his own children. He would talk to them, put cartoons on the TV, and he even threw them birthday parties complete with cake and a happy birthday song. He confessed that there was no sexual element to these dolls, and he simply wanted to rescue the children as they called out to him. He wanted to communicate with them. Anatoly didn't have a girlfriend, he wasn't married, but he did want to be a father. Obviously, without a relationship, this would have been slightly difficult. So against the better wishes and better judgment of his parents, Anatoly applied to adopt a young girl. Whilst his university job provided him with notoriety and celebrity status in the Nizhny Novgorod region, it didn't pay him very well. As you can imagine, social services in Russia were concerned about releasing a child into Anatoly's care. This was a man whose job was to document cemeteries and was known to sleep in fields and drink from puddles. This, coupled with his low income and the fact that he still lived with his parents, made him ineligible. Heartbroken that he was unable to adopt the daughter he so desperately wanted, he turned to stealing young girls' bodies from graves and turning them into dolls. Anatoly had come upon the police radar a few times before. Whilst he was out surveying cemeteries, he was often suspected of vandalism or theft at the cemeteries. However, once he sort of explained who he was, the purpose of his visit, etc., police were pretty soon to let him go about his business. Yeah, he's a bit weird and a bit untoward, but seemingly he was doing nothing that was breaking the law, Being a creep isn't against the law, unfortunately. The general consensus on Anatoly Moskvin was that he was a bit of a weirdo, a bit of a loner, but he wasn't doing anything to hurt anyone, and he certainly wasn't doing anything illegal. He had been commissioned by the Nizhny Novgorod Linguistic University, after all, so he couldn't be up to anything untoward. The full writings of his survey have never been published, for obvious reasons, but editor Alexei Yesin has called it unique and priceless. Yesin works for a weekly Russian paper called Necrologies, a paper that Anatoly himself often wrote for. In November 2011, police were investigating a string of grave desecrations on specifically Muslim graves in the Nizhny Novgorod area. Many believe that the desecrations were in retaliation to the January 24th, 2011 airport attacks, which killed 37 and injured 173. Since Anatoly was known to police and was the most knowledgeable person in the whole oblast about cemeteries, it was natural that they would go to his apartment and talk to him first. In a strange turn of events, Anatoly gave a full confession to police. He told them that he had desecrated graves at loads of different cemeteries around the oblast, and police were happy, but confused. They were actually incorrect in thinking that the attacks had been motivated by the airport bombings. Instead, Anatoly was angry that the courts had failed to take his side in a civil lawsuit in which the other defendant party was a Muslim. Following his confession, his apartment was searched and the Centre for Combating Extremism was brought in to neutralise any possible threats. Nothing, and I mean nothing, could have prepared any of the investigators for what they were about to find next. Inside the apartment were 26 human dolls. Some sat on sofas, some were sat on the floor, but most were surrounded by general clutter that you'd expect to see in a normal functioning household. There is a video that was taken by police to document the sheer volume of things that they found in the apartment. Anatoly only had 26 bodies in his apartment at the time, but it's estimated that he is responsible for desecrating well over 150. The video that shows his apartment just shows it to be in complete disarray. I'd even go so far as to say he was living in squalor, so definitely watch that video at your own discretion. It's a bit filthy, it's a bit grimy, and obviously it's extremely sad. In amongst the evidence, they found instructions written by Anatoly on how to make the dolls. Maps of various cemeteries, although these could have been totally legit and from his university research. But most disturbingly, they found photos and videos of Anatoly actually desecrating the graves. These items were extremely graphic and they showed open graves, bodies of the deceased, so you'll have to, if you want to search those again at your own discretion, it's pretty messed. Following the discovery of his creepy doll factory, Anatoly was arrested and charged under Article 244 of the Russian Criminal Code. According to a document titled The Criminal Code of the Russian Federation, number 63, June 13th, 1996, which is literally a month before I was born, which was adopted by the State Duma on May 24th, 1996, and by the Federation Council on June 5th, 1996. This document has also been translated into English, which, thank the Lord, because I do try with Russian, but I'm not very good at it. So, let's just move on. Article 244 reads as follows. Article 244. Outrages upon the bodies of the deceased and their burial place. 1. Outrages upon the bodies of the deceased or destruction, damage to, or desecration of burial places, gravestones, or graveyard buildings intended for burial ceremonies or for commemorative feasts shall be punishable by a fine in an amount up to 40,000 rubles, which is about 440 quid that I could find online, or in the amount of the wage or salary or any other income of the convicted person for a period of up to 3 months, or by compulsory works for a term of up to 360 hours, or by corrective labour for a term of up to 1 year, or arrest for a term of up to 3 months. So, legal jargon bullshit, very scattered with stuff that doesn't make sense, but there is a punishment, it is against the law. The whole article is actually quite long, so I'll summarise the second part so I don't have to read out 4 pages of legal blah. Any desecration done by a group of people or an organised group who desecrate graves for a political, religious, racial reason, as well as the desecration of graves of victims in the fight against fascism and Nazism, shall be punishable by restraint of liberty for a term of up to 3 years, or by compulsory labour for up to 5 years, or an arrest of 3 to 6 months, or a deprivation of liberty term for up to 5 years. So again, the penalties massively vary. Police were convinced that no person of a sane mind could commit such horrific crimes, and decided that Anatoly should be sent for a psychiatric evaluation. Rightly so, you made a good call. The evaluation showed that Anatoly was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and therefore was unable to stand trial. He could not be held up to his criminal liability, and would instead require treatment. He was present at the hearing where he was found to be criminally insane and unfit to stand trial. He turned to the parents of his victims and said, quote, "You abandoned your girls in the cold, and I brought them home and warmed them up." End quote. For Natalia Chardimova, the accusation of abandoning her child in the cold hit a little too close to home for her. You see, Natalia's daughter Olga was just 10 years old when she was brutally robbed of her bright future. She also became one of Moscovin's dolls for over 9 years. When Olga had just turned 10 years old, she begged her mother to let her walk from the apartment to her babushka's apartment, which was literally only a block away. She said, "Mum, I'm 10 already, I can go myself." And wanting to give her daughter the first taste of freedom, Natalia gave in and let her make the 5-minute journey. Poor Olga didn't even make it out of her own apartment block when she was attacked by a drug addict who forced her to the top floor, stole her earrings, and then bludgeoned her to death with a metal pipe. For 5 agonizing months, the Chardimovas wondered what had happened to their sweet, precious Olga. That was until her remains were found in the apartment block's attic. In an interview given to the Daily Mail, in an article titled, now this one's a long one, "Evil body snatcher dug up my little girl's murdered body, mummified her corpse, and then taunted me for 10 years. Grieving mother relives the nightmare of seeing beloved daughter turned into a human doll," Natalia said, "We buried her on October 2nd, 2002. I could never imagine that almost 10 years later, on October 5th, 2012, I would open her grave with police and find her remains vanished. Her coffin was empty, with a hole at the top from where he had pulled the remains. You can't begin to imagine it. That somebody would touch the grave of your child, the most holy place in this world for you. We have been visiting the grave of our child for 9 years, and we had no idea it was empty. Instead, it was inside this beast's apartment." Now that is just one statement from one of the victims' families, but as you can imagine, the impact of Anatoly's crimes cannot be understated. Already grieving parents were faced with the horrific realization that they had been visiting their own child's empty grave. In the article, Natalia also details how she and her husband started to place decorations around Olga's grave in 2003. When they returned one day to carry on the work, they found a wreath had been moved and there was a note. It was signed only as DA, which is Dobry Angel, or in English that means kind angel. Anatoly wasn't just content on leaving one note, though. He left numerous at Olga's grave, addressing her as Little Lady, and commenting on the start of what should have been her school year in September. Natalia and her husband Igor were shocked and confused about what was happening to their daughter's grave. They brushed it off as a creepy well-wisher who maybe wanted to make the situation, a little bit happier, maybe bring a little bit of comfort to a grieving family, but at the same time, it's really creepy, really weird, very inappropriate, don't do that. He did come across as that, creepy but means well kind of character, until he started threatening the couple by saying, "If you don't erect a great monument which she deserves, we will dig her body out." They gave in to his demands, obviously not wanting their daughter's body to be fucking dug up. But they, made her this great monument, But that wasn't enough for him. He started to scribble all over the headstone, and then obviously when he'd had enough, he just smashed the headstone to pieces. Following this horrific trial, where 26 sets of families had to learn the truth about what had happened to their children, Anatoly Moskvin was sentenced to coercive medical measures and was moved to a psychiatric clinic. Ever since 2013, when he was originally moved to the psychiatric centre, appeals for his treatment to be extended have all been granted. For Natalia Chadimova, it still doesn't feel like justice. From her apartment, she can see the yellow building where Anatoly is being held, and she fears that one day he could simply be released, as there is no set term on his treatment. Perhaps one day medical staff will believe that he's cured and be able to integrate back into society. But luckily, according to a prosecutor, quote, "There is no term. In other words, he is not sent there for the certain number of years. He will stay there until he is cured or forever. The only way for him to get out of this clinic is through another court action, where prosecutors and lawyers will take part. He is now subject to annual checks, but there is very little chance that he even leaves this clinic." End quote. As of the last appeal filed in 2019, an extension for treatment was once again approved for Anatoly. He is still ineligible to stand trial on grounds of mental health and therefore will be kept in the clinic until he is fit to do so, if he is ever fit to do so. Olga is now buried in an unmarked grave where her mother, Natalia, father, Igor, and little brother Alexei can all pay tribute to her in private. In today's time, so in 2020, Olga would be 28 years old. In the eyes of her family, she will always be a beautiful 10-year-old child. Now, a last note. So during my research, I stumbled upon a petition called Free Anatoly Moskvin, started by someone called Gretchen Tender. Now, Gretchen, I don't know if you're a real person or whether that's a pseudonym. I'm not sure whether this is a cruel joke or this petition is serious, but you gotta stop. Their petition is hosted through the website moveon.org and is addressed to President Donald Trump, the Georgia State House, the Georgia State Senate, Governor Brian Kemp, the United States House of Representatives, and the United States Senate. I'm not sure what you want the US to do about a Russian grave robber. I'm not. What's Trump gonna do? Free him now? I don't know. The description reads, Anatoly Moskvin is being unjustly imprisoned in a psychiatric ward for showing a great deal of tender, loving care to dead children. Please help free him from this injustice. She, or they, then go on to link the Daily Mail article that I referenced before, which is where I got most of my information about Olga. In the Why This Is Important section, she states, "Free this innocent man whose only crime was caring too much. Why is it that an archaeologist digs up dead bodies to put on public display is perfectly acceptable, but when Anatoly Moskvin does it, he is a sick criminal? Let's do away with this double standard and free Anatoly to continue his loving work." Are you fucking serious right now? Are you actually fucking serious? Again, some sick fuck who only identified himself as dead_children69 signed the petition and wrote, "Free this poor soul. He did nothing wrong." Again, not sure if this is a joke or if this is people trying to be edgy, but the fact that this petition has 13 signatures is alarming. And again, no one seems to have used their real name. So what are you trying to hide? Why are you hiding all of this? It seems that Moskvin probably won't be getting out of the hospital anytime soon. I hope for the sake of his victims, their loved ones, and the Nizhny Novgorod community that he won't. It appears that Moskvin will spend the rest of his natural life in treatment, where he indefinitely belongs. That was this week's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm very sorry if I sound very weird and my breathing's a bit off and stuff like that. I think I've got a cold coming down. Just need to keep an eye on that. But thank you so much again. I hope you all stay safe in this incredible time of uncertainty. Be nice to each other, look after each other, and most importantly, stay safe and stay spooky.